Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have new veteran-run Libertarian podcast, 8 p.m. every night. Join me for political news and discussion from X.com, posted by Creative Rich 3438. And that looks like a tweet they have, or it looks like it's since been taken down, I guess. But yeah, they had, please join me for my new podcast tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern. Our main topic tonight is mass incarceration. And yeah, personally, I guess that's cool. If people want to start their own podcast, I've been doing this one for nearly 500 episodes now, so that's cool. Ultimately, I would say, as much, maybe we should have bias as possible, because, now's the time that, back in the old days, a lot of people didn't have the ability to get their message out there. Some people might complain, well, if you're not getting views, why even try putting your message out there? But at this point, I think since everyone has access to, well, not everyone, but more people have access to creating YouTube videos or posting comments on social media, they should definitely use that, because back in the past, you only had a few television channels and newspapers to get your opinion out there. Now you have pretty much infinite ways, thanks to social media and the internet. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have bullshit and costly use of military equipment, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the military subreddit. And that looks like how the Apache helicopter was flying over Kid Rock's estate, I think, or by his pool. And yeah, personally, I don't think the Apache helicopter should have been doing a flyover of Kid Rock's house. But ultimately, the U.S. government can justify sending its assets wherever it wants to. I'm sure if the Democrats were in power and they sent Apache helicopter over some woke celebrity's house, Reddit would be completely fine with it. But since it's in-group coded since Kid Rock is out-group coded rather than in-group coded, they think it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, personally, as I said, I don't really care for it, but I do agree that the resources could be sent to probably better use for them. We're in our war with Iran currently. Maybe that you could send that helicopter over there. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, the government, just like everyone else, is going to justify what it wants to justify, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have breaking. GOP Senator Langford just said that the Democrats' demands in the Senate were absolutely absurd. They asked for things, for instance, like ICE could not be at polling places. Meet the Press, free 2026, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Protect U.S. Election subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think ICE should be at polling places, but the government wants to place ICE at polling places. The government can justify placing whoever it wants to at polling places, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I think the libertarian position is, when you have the state controlling elections, they can justify whatever they want in regards to them, and that includes at polling places. I think the libertarian perspective is, we just gotta get rid of forced collectivism altogether. I'm sure if Reddit was in control, though, they'd have all the woke policing the polling stations, and I don't think that's the answer either. I think the libertarian answer is you just got to get rid of all the polling places to begin with, and just get rid of all these elections, because elections are inherently forced collectivism. I think if you want to have an election among a voluntary collective, I think that's fine, but I think forced collectivism is inherently libertarian, as I go into pretty much in every one of these podcasts. Next, we have I meant anti-libertarian, sorry. Or I think I said anti-libertarian, or whatever. Next, we have police used AI facial recognition as the arrest of a Tennessee woman for crimes committed in the states that she says she's never visited, from CNN.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but just go show you the state can justify using whatever tools it wants to arrest whoever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump accused of fueling crisis to distract from Epstein files, from MSN.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I would kind of agree with that, but ultimately, it's people are going to move on to whatever the current thing is. The Epstein files were the current thing for a while. Now it's Iran. It might be something else soon. It's always going to be whatever the current thing is, and that's very much how the news cycle works. It's always going to be something. People talk about one thing, and then they move on to the next thing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have government actions against Anthropic are a classic First Amendment retaliation from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with that. I think if Anthropic doesn't want to work with the government, it shouldn't be forced to work with the government, and the government shouldn't be retaliating against them for not wanting to work with them. But ultimately, the government can justify whatever it wants to justify, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, I do think that Anthropic shouldn't be forced to work with the government. But if the government does want to use force to make them work with them and retaliate against them for not working with them, ultimately oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it, since they have the legal monopoly in use of force. Next, we have Take the Test, Risk Arrest, Why Some HIV-Positive Americans Are Still Forced to Register as Sex Offenders from unclosetedmedia.com, posted by Knee Concussions, and they said, survivors of AIDS-era exposure laws are fighting to overturn statutes that ignore modern science and disproportionately punish LGBTQ Americans of color. For nearly 17 years, LaShonda Salinas Hicks remained shackled to the reality of life on the sex registry. She was legally required to stay 300 feet away from schools, parks, and playgrounds, and she was forced to report on the sheriff's office 4 times a year to risk a felony charge. That's because in 2006, Salinas Hicks' partner pressed charges against her after a breakup, accusing her of having sex without disclosing that she was HIV positive. Although she says her partner knew of her status before engaging in intercourse with her, that didn't stop her from being jailed for about 2 months, put on a 4-year probation, and forced to register as a sex offender. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, we shouldn't have government registries no matter how well-intentioned they are, regardless, I personally think, I don't care for a lot of sex offenders, but I don't really trust the government to run any registry without, putting, ultimately whoever it wants to on it, and that's something that, I think is important. I personally think, you should disclose if you have HIV before you have sex with someone, but ultimately that's not something that the government should be enforcing. I would say, we should be, ultimately, people are going to justify, if someone has HIV and doesn't want to disclose it and you end up getting it as a result, I don't think that's very nice, but, ultimately, you should always, that's why, you can't always trust whatever people say and do. So ultimately, I would say the libertarian perspective is, if HIV positive or AIDS positive patients want to justify having sex without disclosing their thing, I think they should be able to. But the thing is that, I personally think that's morally wrong, but, the government shouldn't be enforcing morality in the first place. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Libertarian Zombie Apocalypse, posted by Maleficent Coyote 85, and that's a YouTube short from The Crucible, The Dead Zone Episode 1, and that's 2 guys talking about on the zombie apocalypse, and one of them says, who has the Vote Libertarian patch on him, says, I like to, screw around with the zombies and have sex with them. And personally, I don't know if zombies could consent to sex. I think everything should be consensual. But, ultimately, if a zombie apocalypse ever does break out, I think the libertarian position is, we're all screwed, justify whatever you want to. If you want to justify having sex with those zombies, I personally think that's kind of very dangerous, especially if you don't restrain them correctly, then probably turn you into a zombie as well. But, ultimately, justify whatever you want to justify, I personally think that, if you want to justify freaky shit, I think you should, with non-humans, ultimately justify whatever you want to. I personally think the libertarian position is, as long as you're not forcing someone to do something, you shouldn't be forced. It's okay. That's my thing on thoughts on bestiality as well. You shouldn't be fucking animals. But if you do want to justify having sex with animals, at least don't force them to do it against their will. Ultimately, you justify whatever you want to justify, though. If you want to screw whoever you want to screw, that's fine. Just don't force them to do it against their will, regardless, especially if they're not human, I would say, like a zombie is, because a zombie is, may have used to be a human, but if I would say they currently don't fall into that category. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Christian lawmaker doesn't believe in climate change because it's not in the Bible, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Religious Fruitcake subreddit. And yeah, personally, if people don't want to believe in climate change for whatever reason, I think that's fine. Believe in whatever you want to for whatever reason you want to. Reddit says, if you don't believe in transgender people, you're a fascist, Hitler, Nazi, etc., and ultimately, believe in whatever you want to, for whatever reasons you want to. If you don't think it's, if you don't like what the reasons or something someone does or doesn't believe in, and the reasons someone does or doesn't believe it, that's fine. And if you don't call out, that's fine. But, ultimately, Reddit, Reddit believes what it believes, and this woman believes what she believes, so justify believing whatever you want to believe, for whatever reasons, however you want to believe them, however stupid they are, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have How We End Up with Bad Government, posted by FastSteveRuvinus739, and that's cross-posted from the Anarcho-Capitalism subreddit, and it looks like some guy in a red hat, some boomer in a red hat, says things they don't care about: taxes, size of federal government, foreign military intervention, inflation 2A, liberty, gas prices, things they care about. What's that 15-year-old trans person doing? And yeah, personally, I guess I would agree with that. The Uniparty uses the culture war to distract from the fact that they pretty much agree on everything, like taxes, the size of the federal government, foreign military intervention, inflation, the Second Amendment, liberty, and gas prices. But ultimately, I would say the libertarian position is, ultimately, justify whatever you want to justify. I personally think, a lot of underage trans people can't consent to a lot of what's marketed as gender affirming care. But, if they want to justify consenting to it, ultimately that's on them. I think the libertarian position is, identify whatever you want to and justify doing whatever surgeries you want to on yourself. But, that doesn't mean I have to like it. It's like I feel like a lot of gender affirming care is going to be looked back on, like we look back on lobotomies, there's something that's inherently kind of going to be discredited, but, ultimately justify doing whatever you want to. If you want to justify getting a double mastectomy at 15 or 16, I personally think, especially if it's for transgender reasons, I personally don't care for it, but, people are going to justify using whatever economic and social capital they have, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump is threatening to blow up Iranian desalination plants, posted by Plasman30, and they said, would that be a violation of the Geneva Convention and a war crime? I'm fully aware he doesn't give a shit, but shouldn't the Joint Chiefs of Staff kind of point this out? I know checks and balances went out the window decades ago, but committing a war crime is a step we should not cross. Supposedly in his first term he was going to assassinate a lot of people he didn't like, and they kept telling him, he's not allowed to do that. And yeah, personally, ultimately, war crime is just going to be another subjective term. Ultimately, if you're not in a position to, the government can justify doing whatever it wants to, and that does include stuff that might be labeled as war crimes. But ultimately, when it comes to any kind of crime, it matters who's enforcing it. And on an international scale, there's not international. I guess you could argue the United Nations and maybe the Geneva Conventions as well. But they're often more all bark and no bite. If you want to justify, so ultimately, when it comes to whatever nations want to justify, they can justify it, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, the president always, a president can really just, I would say, it's mostly just gusto from Trump. I don't think they're actually going to blow up Iranian desalination plants, but if they want to, and they have the ability to get away with it, ultimately, sometimes people can get away with things you don't like. And that's how the world works. Obama blew up the U.S. government, or I should say, the U.S. Air Force under Obama blew up a hospital, I think, Afghanistan. And, that's not something I care for either. But, Reddit's kind of memory hold that. And now they're all on Trump bad. And it just goes to show you that, the U.S. government can justify bombing pretty much whoever it wants to. And it will get away with it usually scot-free. And people will just kind of memory hold it if it goes against their narratives that, the other branch of the Uniparty is bad. And it just goes to show you that, people don't really care about what the U.S. government's bombing. They just care of who's in charge, if it's the in-group or the out-group, even though I would say both of them are the out-group to me, because, as George Carlin famously said, it's a big club and you ain't in it, and that's very much how I feel about the U.S. government bombing pretty much anywhere in the Middle East, or the world for that matter, but mostly ends up that they bomb into the Middle East for first and foremost. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.